Nuno Miguel Cardoso Machado. The aporia of Marx's concept of labor, a chronological analysis. Note, this paper is a slightly extended, English, version of Machado, Nuno Miguel Cardoso, 2018, a aporia do conceito de trabalho em Marx, uma análise cronológica, in Raposo, Rita et al. Orgs, Utopia, Anarquia e Sociedade, escrito em homenagem a José Maria Carvalho Ferreira. Coimbra, Almedina, page 371-403. Abstract. Labor probably represents the most contradictory of all Marxian concepts. In his earlier works, Marx defines labor negatively, as an inevitably alienated form of activity, which is peculiar to capitalist modernity. This stance then begins to change in the Grundrisse, in which labor is understood ambiguously, sometimes as a capitalist category and sometimes as a transhistorical category. Finally, from a contribution to the critique of political economy onwards, Marx adopts a twofold concept of labor, concrete labor and abstract labor. In this context, only the time-bound character of abstract labor is acknowledged, whereas concrete labor is equated with the material form of reproduction of all human societies. In this article, the evolution of the Marxian notion of labor undergoes chronological analysis with the ultimate goal of transcending the aporias embedded in Marx's work and proposing a coherent understanding of labor as a historically specific form of activity. Keywords: Marx, concrete labor, abstract labor, reproduction, alienation. Introduction. Labor is probably the most ambiguous, and even contradictory, concept in the Marxian theoretical edifice. In his early works, Marx defines labor negatively as an inevitably alienated form of activity specific to capitalist modernity. This stance first begins to change in the Grundrisse, in which labor is portrayed ambiguously, sometimes as a capitalist category and other occasions as a transhistorical category. Finally, following the publication of a contribution to the critique of political economy, Marx adopts a twofold concept of labor, concrete labor and abstract labor. In this context, only the time-bound character of abstract labor gets acknowledged, whereas concrete labor is equated with the material form of reproduction of all human societies. As Moishe Postone has observed, most Marxist authors overlook the antinomies of Marx's concept and instead understand labor as a transhistorical, ontological category. Cf. Postone, 2003. The case of the late Lukács proves paradigmatic in this respect. Cf. Lukács, 1980. Other authors, while attempting to critique labor, end up themselves maintaining an eminently aporetical relationship with this category. The crassest example probably stems from that of Guy Debord and the Situationist International, whose theory proposes the motto "Ne travaillez jamais" as coexisting with the demand for quote, "all power to the workers." End quote. Cf. Debord 2014. Varnagem, 2000 did a critical understanding of labor as an exclusively bourgeois category begin finally to arise in the Marxist field. This theoretical stance, which nonetheless continues to be upheld by just an obstinate minority, traces its roots back to the pioneering works of André Gorz, cf. 1982, and, for its most recent developments, Jean-Marie Vincent, cf. 1987, Moishe Postone, cf. 2003, The Crisis Group, cf. 1999. Robert Kurtz, cf. 2016, Anselm Jaap, cf. 2006, and John Holloway, cf. 2010. This article takes a chronological approach to analyzing the evolution of the Marxian notion of labor. Thereby, I correspondingly seek, by way of an imminent, exegetical analysis, to present textual evidence that lends support to the thesis of a changing concept of labor throughout Marx's life. It nevertheless goes without saying that, quote, "even an imminent reconstruction cannot be but interpretative." End quote. Rutten, 2004, 118. The ultimate goal involves superseding the aporias that penetrate Marx's work and proposing a coherent understanding of labor as a historically specific form of activity. I thus seek to rescue the most radical core of Marx's reflections on labor. Thus, in other words, I aim to proceed with Marx beyond Marx towards a critique of labor. Labor in Marx's early writings. In his early works, Marx still does not apply a twofold concept of labor, concrete/abstract labor, to classify productive activities under capitalism. This dual concept only becomes definitively adopted in A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, published in 1859. Thus, in the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, written in 1844, when Marx was only 26 years old, labor gets described a. as an inherently alienated activity which eludes the control of human beings. In Marx's view, quote, labor is only an expression of human activity within alienation, an expression of life as alienation of life. End quote. Marx, 1992b, 369, emphasis in original. b. As the essence of private property. Marx stresses that, quote, the subjective essence of private property is activity for itself, as person, is labor. End quote. Marx, 1992b, 341, emphasis in original. Marx therefore argues that it is possible to deduce all the other economic categories, money, capital, competition, etc., from these two basic categories, labor and private property. Marx, 1992b, 333. Furthermore, in capitalist society, alienation, quote, is understood to gravitate around the estrangement of labor. End quote. Arthur, 1986, 3. That is, all other forms of manifestation of alienation result from the alienation of labor. Ibid. The concept of labor is thus eminently negative. Labor is an, quote, unfree activity. Marx, 1992b, 331. Quote, the denial of man carried through to its logical conclusion. End quote. Marx, 1992b, 342. Marx deplores how the individual exists, quote, not as a human being but as a worker. End quote. Marx, 1992b, 287. In his role as a worker, he sees himself, quote, depressed, both intellectually and physically to the level of a machine. End quote. He is a man reduced to pure, quote, abstract activity. End quote. Marx, 1992b, 285. Marx characterizes labor as an alienated activity in the following way. Quote, labor is external to the worker, i.e. does not belong to his essential being, he therefore does not confirm himself in his work, but denies himself, feels miserable and not happy, does not develop free mental and physical energy, but mortifies his flesh and ruins his mind. Hence the worker feels himself only when he is not working, when he is working he does not feel himself. He is at home when he is not working, and not at home when he is working. His labor is therefore not voluntary but forced, it is forced labor. It is therefore not the satisfaction of a need but a mere means to satisfy needs outside itself. Its alien character is clearly demonstrated by the fact that as soon as no physical or other compulsion exists it is shunned like the plague. External labor, labor in which man alienates himself, is a labor of self-sacrifice, of mortification, just as in religion the spontaneous activity of the human imagination, the human brain and the human heart detaches itself from the individual and reappears as the alien activity of a god or a devil, so the activity of the worker is not his own spontaneous activity, it is a loss of his self. End quote. Marx, 1992b, 326 to 327, emphasis in original. Note: Marx also upholds this idea in excerpts from James Mill's Elements of Political Economy, written in the same year. Quote, "In the framework of private property, labor is the alienation of life. Since I work in order to live, in order to procure for myself the means of life, my labor is not life. I loathe this activity, it is a torture to me." End quote. Marx, 1992 c. 278, emphasis in original. Marx restates this position in Wage, Labor and Capital, a text written in 1847. Quote, "And the worker, who for 12 hours weaves, spins, drills, turns, builds, shovels, breaks stones, carries loads, etc., does he consider this 12 hours weaving, spinning, drilling, turning, building, shoveling, stone breaking as a manifestation of his life, as life? On the contrary, life begins for him where this activity ceases, at table, in a public house, in bed." End quote. Marx, 1977, 203. Endnote. Marx adds that the quote, "act of estrangement of practical human activity, of labor." End quote. Marx, 1992b, 327. Must be considered in the light of the relationship of the worker to the product of labor, as an alien object that has power over him. This relationship is at the same time the relationship to the sensuous external world, to natural objects, as an alien world confronting him in hostile opposition. 2. The relationship of labor to the act of production. Within labor, this relationship is the relationship of the worker to his own activity as something which is alien, activity as passivity, power as impotence, procreation as emasculation, the worker's own physical and mental energy, his personal life, as an activity directed against himself, which is independent of him and does not belong to him. End quote. Ibid, emphasis in original. In addition to being an inescapably alienated activity, labor is not presented as an ontological category. Arthur remarks that, generally speaking, in the manuscripts, it is the category of quote, "productive activity." End quote. That seems to take on an quote, "ontological significance for Marx." End quote. Arthur, 1986, 10. Thus, labor is understood as a form of quote, "second-order mediation." End quote. Arthur, 1986, 11. i.e., as a historically specific form taken by productive activity. If in capital, and, in fact, as soon as a contribution to the critique of political economy. Concrete, labor becomes a timeless category, i.e., equated to productive activity as such. The same cannot be said about Marx's early writings. Arthur, 1986, 12. Even though Marx is not, quote, "absolutely consistent," quote, Arthur, 1986, 13. It is safe to say that in the manuscripts, as well as in the comments on Friedrich List, and in the German ideology. Note: some passages that substantiate this assertion are presented below. Endnote. The term labor, restrictively defined as the term quote, "productive activity carried on under the rule of private property." End quote. Arthur, 1986, 12, emphasis in original. In other words, as the productive activity peculiar to capitalist modernity. In short, labor is not an ontological category that mediates the material interchange with nature in all human societies. It comes as no surprise, therefore, that Marx calls for its abolition. The elimination of alienation demands the abolition of labor. Furthermore, should labor be the cause of private property, then the latter cannot be abolished without the simultaneous abolition of labor itself. Zilberscheid, 2004, 130. This is exactly what Marx suggests in his comments on free labor is the living basis of private property. It is private property as the creative source of itself. Private property is nothing but objectified labor. If it is desired to strike a mortal blow at private property, one must attack it not only as a material state of affairs, but also as activity, as labor. It is one of the greatest misapprehensions to speak of free, human, social labor, of labor without private property. Labor by its very nature is unfree, unhuman, unsocial activity, determined by private property and creating private property. Hence the abolition of private property will become a reality only when it is conceived as the abolition of labor. An organization of labor, therefore, is a contradiction. The best organization that labor can be given is the present organization, free competition, the dissolution of all its previous apparently social organization. End quote. Marx, 1975, 278-279, emphasis in original. In the German ideology, Marx restates on several occasions this idea that labor will be abolished under communism. Quote, 1. In all previous revolutions the mode of activity always remained unchanged, and it was only a question of a different distribution of this activity, whilst the communist revolution is directed against the hitherto existing mode of activity, does away with labor. Marx and Engels, 1975, 52, emphasis in original. 2. Thus, the proletarians, if they are to assert themselves as individuals, have to abolish the hitherto prevailing condition of their existence, namely, labor. Marx and Engels, 1975, 80. 3. The modern state, the rule of the bourgeoisie, is based on freedom of labor. Freedom of labor is free competition of the workers among themselves. Labor is free in all civilized countries. It is not a matter of freeing labor but of abolishing it. Marx and Engels, 1975, 205, emphasis in original. 4. If communism wants to abolish both the worry of the burgher and the poverty of the proletarian, it goes without saying that it cannot do this without abolishing the cause of both, i.e., labor. Marx and Engels, 1975, 219. Arthur draws attention to the obvious fact that when Marx quote, speaks of the abolition of labor, he certainly does not mean the abolition of material productive activity itself. End quote. Arthur, 1986, 137. Indeed, Zilberscheid shares this opinion. Quote, the abolition of labor is not an abolition of production itself but a transformation of the prevailing mode of production into a new mode that can no longer be termed labor. End quote. Zilberscheid, 2004, 117. Since this is to shed its instrumental nature, the abolition of labor means that, in a communist society, labor becomes superseded by a form of quote, spontaneous and free activity. End quote. Marx, 1992b, 329. One is therefore allowed to conclude that, according to the young Marx, quote, the communist form of productive activity cannot be understood as the most free form of labor, that is, labor that is democratically organized by the workers. Communism would not be based on labor, but rather on a new mode of productive activity, which would break the continuity of human history. End quote. Zilberscheid, 2004, 119. In particular, communism would suppress specialization, which, under capitalism, presents itself in the form of the division of labor. Marx is peremptory: the division of labor cripples individuals. Marx and Engels, 1975, 292, 437. Labor prevents the free development of individuality, the multifaceted blooming of human capabilities. Marx and Engels, 1975, 400-401. As, quote, each man has a particular, exclusive sphere of activity, which is forced upon him and from which he cannot escape. End quote. Marx and Engels, 1975, 47. In communism, conversely, the role of the specialist, of the worker, disappears altogether. Quote, in communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, shepherd or critic. Ibid. End quote. Labor in the Grundrisse. Historical or transhistorical category? The Grundrisse, written during the years of 1857 and 1858, formed the first draft of Capital. The book is the result of a decade in which Marx devoted himself to a profound study of the canon of political economy. In this work, the Marxian concept of labor becomes eminently aporetical. Marx begins with the following observation. Quote, labor seems a quite simple category. The conception of labor in this general form, as labor as such, is also immeasurably old. Nevertheless, when it is economically conceived in this simplicity, labor is as modern a category as of the relations which create this simple abstraction. End quote. Marx, 1993, 103. Marx adds that labor may be understood as, quote, the abstract expression for the simplest and most ancient relation in which human beings, in whatever form of society, play the role of producers. This is correct in one respect, not in another. End quote. Marx, 1993, 104, emphasis added. For only after the historical appearance of, quote, the abstract universality of wealth-creating activity, Ibid. End quote, does it become possible to speak of, quote, labor in general, Ibid. End quote, and wealth in general, that, i.e., quote, this abstraction of labor as such is not merely the mental product, end quote, or mental generalization dash, quote, of a concrete totality of labors, Ibid. End quote, because, quote, not only the category, labor, but labor in reality has here become the means of creating wealth in general, and has ceased to be organically linked with particular individuals in any specific form, Ibid. End quote. In other words, labor became a real abstraction. Marx concludes that, quote, the abstraction of the category labor, labor as such, labor pure and simple, the simplest abstraction, then, which modern economics places at the head of its discussions, and which expresses an immeasurably ancient relation valid in all forms of society, nevertheless achieves practical truth as an abstraction only as a category of the most modern society. This example of labor shows strikingly how even the most abstract categories, despite their validity, precisely because of their abstractness, for all epochs, are nevertheless, in the specific character of this abstraction, themselves likewise a product of historic relations, and possess their full validity only for and within these relations. End quote. Marx, 1993, 105. These passages from the Grundrisse throw up a series of apparent contradictions. On the one hand, labor is defined as an antediluvian, transhistorical category, which is present in all forms of society. On the other hand, Marx stresses that one can speak really of labor, i.e., that labor only becomes an actuality in capitalist modernity. As the Anglo-Saxon saying goes, you can't have your cake and eat it. In contradistinction to his early works, Marx seems incapable of determining unequivocally whether labor does constitute an ontological category. I would like to suggest that the solution to this riddle may stem from recalling a famous Marxian aphorism. Quote, "Human anatomy contains a key to the anatomy of the ape, Ibid." End quote. Indeed, it is well nigh impossible not to catch a glimpse, in these theoretical false starts, of the reasoning that leads Marx to adopt a twofold concept of labor, concrete labor and abstract labor. Although the German philosopher still does not yet deploy this terminology in the Grundrisse. Thus, Marx seems to be saying that labor, understood as a concrete activity, as the generic material production of certain goods. Note: Section 5 conveys how the very notion of concrete labor, of material labor in general, itself constitutes a historically specific type of abstraction. Endnote. Amounts to a very ancient category, quasi-ontological. However, abstractly social labor really abstract labor, which creates wealth in general, i.e., economic value, is a category pertaining only to the capitalist mode of production. Positive versus negative understandings of labor. Of the Grundrisse, the negative conception of labor, present in the early works, is replaced by a positive understanding. Labor, quote, is a positive, creative activity. End quote. Marx, 1973, 614, emphasis in original. Consequently, the goal no longer involves the abolition of labor, that is, its supersession by a higher form of activity, but the transformation of labor into a supposedly free labor. Marx criticizes Adam Smith's exclusively negative view of labor. Marx, 1973, 611. In Marx's perspective, labor can be, quote, a liberating activity, end quote, whose aims are posited by the individuals themselves. Ibid. Therefore, labor can embody the, quote, self-realization, objectification of the subject, hence real freedom. Ibid. End quote. To this day, quote, in its historic forms as slave labor, serf labor, and wage labor, labor always appears as repulsive, always as external forced labor, and not labor, by contrast, as freedom and happiness. Ibid. Emphasis in original. End quote. This remains so because there were not yet created, quote, the subjective and objective conditions, end quote, which are necessary for labor to become, quote, attractive work, the individual's self-realization. Ibid. End quote. However, in other excerpts, material, industrial labor is presented explicitly as an unfree activity belonging to the realm of necessity that should be reduced by as much as possible. It is free time, erected over and above labor time, which thus appears as the realm of freedom, the most important feature of the development of productive forces, thereby becoming the potential reduction of the, quote, labor time necessary to meet absolute needs, end quote, and the resulting creation of, quote, free time, end quote, for other kinds of activities. Marx, 1973, 612, emphasis in original. This is a crucial aspect, since, quote, labor time as the measure of wealth posits an individual's entire time as labor time, and his degradation therefore to mere worker, subsumption under labor. End quote. Marx, 1975, 708, translation amended. There is, thus, a fundamental aporia in the Grundrisse. On the one hand, labor is defined as a potentially free form of activity. On the other hand, the communism that Marx envisages is substantiated in the reduction of labor time to its very minimum and in the maximization of the individual's free time. Labor after a contribution to the critique of political economy. Adoption of a twofold concept of labor, concrete labor and abstract labor. As just seen above, it does still prove possible to discern in the Grundrisse, at least in some passages, an understanding, even if somewhat contradictory, of labor as a historically specific category. However, in the following year, as soon as a contribution to the critique of political economy is published, Marx definitively adopts an ontological 2004, 136. Marx writes that it is extremely important, quote, to grasp the difference between labor as a producer of something useful, a use value, and labor as a producer of exchange value, a specific social form of wealth. End quote. Marx, 1987, 278. On the one hand, quote, labor which creates exchange value is a specifically bourgeois feature. End quote. Marx, 1987, 298. On the other hand, quote, as useful activity directed to the appropriation of natural factors in one form or another, labor is a natural condition of human existence, a condition of material interchange between man and nature, quite independent of the form of society. End quote. Marx, 1978, 278, emphasis added. Marx introduces, thus, in a contribution to the critique of political economy, the dual concept of labor, concrete labor and abstract labor, that will inform his later economic work. In Volume 1 of Capital, published in 1867, Marx deduces this twofold character of labor from the dual nature of the commodity, the, quote, elementary form, end quote, of capitalist wealth. The commodity is the contradictory unity of use value and value. Marx, 1992a, 125. Now, according to Marx, labor in capitalism also displays a twofold nature. To the extent that labor produces use values, it is concrete. Distinct use values, bread, chairs, etc., require qualitatively different labor. Marx, 1992a, 132. Concrete labor produces, therefore, material wealth. Marx, 1992a, 134. i.e., concrete wealth. One should also note that this materialistic and ontological definition of concrete labor is already to be found in several drafts of Capital, in particular in the Economic Manuscript of 1861-63. Quote, the production process of capital, looked at from its material side, the production of use values, is, first of all, a labor process in general, and as such it displays the general factors which pertain to this process as such under the most varied forms of social production. These factors are determined, namely, by the nature of labor as labor. End quote. Marx, 1988, 92, emphasis in original. In short, the later writings of Marx stress that concrete labor, quote, is a condition of human existence which is independent of all forms of society. It is an eternal natural necessity which mediates the metabolism between man and nature, and therefore human life itself. End quote. Marx, 1992a, 133. Note: examples of the ontological understanding of concrete labor abound in the preparatory drafts of Capital. Here are some additional passages of the Economic Manuscript of 1861-63. Labor is the appropriation of nature for the satisfaction of human needs, the activity through which the metabolism between man and nature is mediated. End quote. Marx, 1988, 40. Quote, but whatever its changed shape may be, as a labor process in general, i.e. as a labor process viewed in abstraction from its historical determinateness, it always contains the general moments of the labor process as such. End quote. Marx, 1988, 92-93. We may find identical statements in the results of the immediate process of production. Quote, work is the eternal natural condition of human existence, Hence the universal features of the labor process are independent of every specific social development. End quote. Marx, 1992d, 998. Marx is conclusive. Quote. Looking at the process of production from its real side, i.e. as a process which creates new use values by performing useful labor with existing use values, we find it to be a real labor process. As such, its elements, its conceptually specific components, are those of the labor process itself, of any labor process, irrespective of the mode of production or the stage of economic development in which they find themselves. End quote. Marx, 1992d, 981, emphasis in original. Endnote. Regarding the value of the commodity, Marx argues that this bears no relation to its sensuous attributes as a use value, thus, value cannot be produced by concrete labor. The exchange of commodities presupposes precisely that which its natural features are abstracted from. Now, should an abstraction be made from its distinct physical proprieties, then there only remains one common underlying feature to all commodities. Quote. That of being products of labor. End quote. Marx, 1992a, 128. But of an undifferentiated labor. Quote. If we consider commodities as values, we consider them exclusively under the single aspect of realized, fixed, or, if you like, crystallized social labor. In this respect they can differ only by representing greater or smaller quantities of labor. We arrive, therefore, at this conclusion. A commodity has a value, because it is a crystallization of social labor. End quote. Marx, 1985, 122, emphasis in original. This social labor is not, however, specific labor, carpenter's labor, weaver's labor, etc. As values, all the sensuous characteristics of the commodities and all the concrete forms of the labors that produced them are erased. Marx, 1992a, 128. Therefore, in order for the commodities to acquire the quality of values, and, as such, be exchanged, the qualitatively distinct labors expended in their production must be, quote, reduced to the same kind of labor, human labor in the abstract, ibid. Consequently, the labor that produces values proves an abstract labor. Abstract labor, quote, is the common social substance of all commodities. End quote. Marx, 1985, 121, emphasis in original. Or, in other words, abstract labor is the substance of value. In abstract labor, all particular determinations of productive activity are effaced. Labor counts only as mere, quote, productive expenditure of human brains, muscles, nerves, hands, etc. End quote. Marx, 1992a, 134. According to Marx, in their quality as values, the commodities represent a, quote, phantom-like objectivity. They are merely congealed quantities of homogeneous human labor, i.e. of human labor power expended without regard to the form of its expenditure. All these things now tell us is that human labor power has been expended to produce them. Human labor is accumulated in them. As crystals of this social substance, which is common to them all, they are values, commodity values. End quote. Marx, 1992a, 128. We may therefore conclude that, in capital, labor, similarly to the commodity, contains a twofold nature. On the one hand, it is concrete labor, i.e., a specific activity which produces a certain use value. On the other hand, it is abstract labor, i.e., undifferentiated human labor which produces value. One should keep in mind, however, that this does not account for two different labor processes. Labor is, simultaneously, concrete and abstract. Quote, the same labor is specified in differing and even contradictory manner. End quote. Marx, 1976a, 8-9, emphasis in original. Note. Quote, Labor does not start with being concrete, and then becomes abstract, according to the Marxian theory of duplication. In commodity production, all labor is, at the same time, abstract and concrete. Any commodity producing labor is always inevitably abstract and concrete. End quote. Sharp, 2006, 42-43, emphasis in original. Endnote. The labor process and the valorization process. As is well known, Marx, through detailed analysis of the immediate process of production, unveils the origin of surplus value in the exploitation of labor power, i.e., in the unpaid labor time provided by the worker to the capitalist. This analysis thus develops the dual character of labor as contained in the commodity. Quote, "The commodity, from which we proceeded as something already given, is viewed here in the process of its becoming." End quote. Marx, 1988, 68. In Marx's view, capitalist production, as the productive consumption of means of production and of labor power, is simultaneously a labor process, which creates use values, and a valorization process, which creates surplus value. Its result is a commodity with a certain use value and input thereby need. Quote, "In the first place, to consider the labor process independently of any specific social formation." End quote. Marx, 1992a, 283. Thus, as the process whereby human beings appropriate and transform natural matter, endow it with a useful form within the aim of satisfying their needs, ibid. Generally speaking, there are three types of inputs in the process of production: the objects of labor, raw and auxiliary materials, the means of labor, tools, machinery, buildings, etc., and labor power. Marx, 1992a, 284. From the viewpoint of the labor process, these various inputs get combined, materially and technically, to produce a certain use value. Therefore, the worker, quote, makes use of the mechanical, physical and chemical properties, end quote, of the things at his/her disposal so as to transform matter, quote, in accordance with his purposes, end quote. Marx, 1992a, 285. This concrete labor process, quote, is extinguished in the product, end quote. Marx, 1992a, 287. It instead becomes objectified in a particular use value, ibid. However, as we already know, under capitalism, workers do not only produce mere use values, but commodities, which amount to the unity of use value and value. Thus, use values are produced only insofar as they are the, quote, material substratum, end quote. Marx, 1992a, 293. Of value, use values are sheer bearers of value, ibid. The purpose of all capitalist companies is to produce commodities whose value is higher than the sum total value of the inputs required for production, i.e., greater than the combined value of the objects of labor, of the means of labor and of labor power, ibid. We may thus state that the purpose of commodity production encapsulates, quote, not just value, but also surplus value, ibid. End quote. Now, while only human labor adds new value to a certain commodity, surplus value creating labor must be considered as playing a completely different role than that played in the concrete labor process. Value generating labor is a qualitatively homogeneous labor that can display only quantitative differences. In short, the valorization process corresponds to an abstract labor process in which the specific contents of the various labors expended are effaced. From the valorization point of view, the productive consumption of the inputs previously mentioned, objects of labor, means of labor and labor power, must yield surplus value. We thus face a specific social feature of capitalist production in which living labor plays a crucial role. The expenditure of abstract labor allows for the creation of enough value to replace the value of labor power, wages, and, beyond that, creates excess value, surplus value. In summary, the productive inputs are considered in terms of the economic value. They add to the objects and the means of labor simply transfer, whether totally or partially, their value to the commodities produced. Note: in other words, the value of these inputs simply reappears in the value of the commodities produced. Thus, surplus value is produced exclusively by unpaid human labor. Endnote. To the extent that it creates surplus value, the capitalist process of production proves itself to be a valorisation process, a process of augmenting the capital invested. In this sense, quote, just as the commodity itself is a unity formed of use value and value, so the process of production must be a unity, composed of the labor process and the process of creating value, ibid. End quote. Marx clarifies, once more, that, quote, it is not two distinct real processes, but the same process, viewed at one time in terms of its content, at the other time according to its form. End quote. Marx, 1988, 140, emphasis in original. Well, quote, capital as a form consists not of objects of labor and labor, but rather of values. End quote. Marx, 1993, 312, emphasis in original. This therefore strongly emphasizes how, quote, within capitalist production, the relationship between the labor process and the valorization process is that the latter appears as the purpose, the former only as the means. The former is therefore stopped when the latter is no longer possible or not yet possible. End quote. Marx, 1988, 96. Whenever, for instance, the production of a certain good does not return a profit, then that labor process will simply cease being carried out. The problems of a materialistic definition of labor. Marx's proposal of a dual concept of labor, concrete/abstract labor, would seem a logically coherent theoretical development. Marx intended to show that value creation is not a property accruing from the particular sensuous character of labor, but from its general, abstract, social character. However, the transhistorical status bestowed upon concrete labor is, in turn, highly questionable. After a contribution to the critique of political economy, the concept of labor in the early works, clearly understood as historically specific, gives way to a twofold concept that itself turns out problematic insofar as the historicity of concrete labor is denied, that is, only abstract labor is acknowledged as a specificity of capitalist modernity. Quote, insofar as labor creates use values, is appropriation of the natural world for human needs, it is the universal condition for the metabolic interaction between nature and man, and as such a natural condition of human life it is independent of, equally common to, all particular social forms of human life. The same is true of the labor process in its general forms. The labor process itself appears in its general form, hence still in no specific form does not express any particular historical, social relation of production entered into by human beings in the production of their social life. End quote. Marx, 1988, 63, emphasis in original. Here, Marx falls prey to a basic mistake and to the kind of reasoning that he himself constantly reproaches the political economists of his time for making. Quote, if, then, the specific form of capital is abstracted away, and only the content is emphasized, then of course nothing is easier than to demonstrate that capital is a necessary condition for all human production. The proof of this proceeds precisely by abstraction from the specific aspects which make it the moment of a specifically developed historic stage of human production. End quote. Marx, 1993, 258, emphasis in original. It is striking how the procedure Marx reproaches economists for, in addressing the capital category, constitutes the very same methodological procedure that he himself adopts regarding concrete labor, all the specific social and technical. Features of the production process are abstracted away and an action subsumed under the transhistorical category of labor process. Should one follow this same misleading point of view, nothing becomes easier than equating and subsuming the activities of Bushman hunters, Athenian slaves, medieval peasants or factory workers under the same timeless concept of concrete, material labor. Marx commits an error symmetrical to the one done by the economists. While these equate the means of production in its material dimension to capital as such, Marx suggests, in several excerpts quoted above, that the material content of modern reproduction, what he calls the technical material labor process, and the material content of wealth, understood as use value, remain untainted, untouched by the social form of self-valorizing value, by capital. Thus, material, reproduction in technological and organizational terms would be, supposedly, a transhistorical category. Well, both the material content and the social form are always historically specific, and the latter has precedence over the former, shrouding it in a particular way and, by doing so, imprinting it with certain specific qualities. Consequently, one cannot help but feel astonished by the fact that Marx strives to avoid using ontological categories at all cost, always pointing out the time-bound character of the categories in his critique of political economy, before then, without noticing this, abandoning this methodological principle when approaching the concept of concrete labor, unreservedly bestowing it with the status of a transhistorical category. While true that Marx sometimes refers to this category as nothing more than a platitude, a commonplace with very little analytical use, Marx tells us that, quote, "It is entirely certain that human production possesses definite laws or relations which remain the same in all forms of production. These identical characteristics are quite simple and can be summarized in a very small number of commonplace phrases." End quote. Marx, 1994, 236, emphasis in original. Endnote. The fact of the matter remains that the labor process concept, as a material substratum of all forms of social production, is inherently problematic and blatantly contradicts the Marxian notion of real subsumption, cf. 5.3. Note. The real subsumption of labor under capital refers to the historical establishment of a material production process, in technological and organizational terms. Specifically, capitalist. Endnote. This aporetical conception is dismissed by Marx himself in other passages. Marx argues, for example, in contrast to the theoretical stance we have just criticized, that material production must be grasped in its definite historical form. Marx, 1989b, 182, emphasis in original. Marx censures political economy for not conceiving material production itself historically, conceiving it, instead, quote, as production of material goods in general, not as a definite historically developed and specific form of this production, ibid, emphasis in original. End quote. We have come a full circle. We are faced with a Marx critical of Marx, a Marx that addresses the aporias of his own thinking. The ontological notion of the labor process does not stand up to confrontation with the basic principles of the Marxian critique of political economy, which argues that, quote, all production is appropriation of nature on the part of an individual within and through a specific form of society. End quote. Marx, 1993, 43, emphasis added. Marx stresses that, in capitalism, there is, quote, a relation of the worker to his own activity, which is by no means the natural one, but which itself already contains a specific economic character. End quote. Marx, 1993, 243, emphasis in original. Well, if the relation of the individual with labor is not a natural relation and instead reflects a specific capitalist economic character, then labor simply cannot be considered an anthropological constant. Moreover, In the economic manuscript of 1861-63, Marx denounces the ills of capitalist industrial society, reproaching, quote, the apologists of the factory system. The apologists of this complete de-individualization of labor, confinement in barrack-like factories, military discipline, subjugation to the machinery, regulation by the stroke of the clock, surveillance by overseers, complete destruction of any development in mental or physical activity. End quote. Marx, 1991, 490-491. Emphasizes the industrial labor that dehumanizes individuals. Thus, not only is abstract labor but also concrete labor is subject to Marx's critique, those concrete forms taken by productive activities under capitalism. Industrial production is thus not taken for granted in some positive way, and so this extends beyond being simply a matter of removing the obstacles posed by capital to the development of the productive forces and rather involves transforming those productive forces. Marx's mature theory, when taken to its logical conclusion, does not limit itself to a critique of abstract labor but instead also takes aim at concrete labor. Concrete labor and abstract labor are therefore the two poles of a fetishist and historically specific category, labor. Towards a radical critique of labor. Marx's contradictions. The Marxian concept of labor thus zigzags and proves prone to aporias. According to Botelho, quote, it is possible to ascertain a series of advances, setbacks, contradictions and lapses in Marx's thinking about labor, end quote, which reflect, quote, an obstinate conceptual struggle with a problematic subject, end quote. Botelho, 2009, 43. Lamash reinforces this idea in observing how Marx finds himself, quote, in a theoretical dilemma, which leads him in several places in his works to numerous contradictory statements about the supposedly ontological grounding of labor as the basis of human emancipation. End quote. Lamash, 2007, 33. Critique of the Gotha Program, a late work of Marx, written in 1875, illustrates perfectly this contradictory understanding of labor. On the one hand, we may find the Marx critical of labor, arguing that, quote, the system of wage labor is a system of slavery, and indeed of a slavery which becomes more severe in proportion as the social productive forces of labor develop, whether the worker receives better or worse payment. End quote. Marx, 1989a, 92. On the other hand, there is the Marx apologetic of labor, including child labor. Quote, a general prohibition of child labor is incompatible with the existence of large-scale industry and hence an empty, pious wish. Its implementation, if it were possible, would be reactionary. End quote. Marx, 1989a, 98, emphasis in original. Note. In the Volume 1 of Capital, Marx had already written that, quote, the germ of the education of the future is present in the factory system. This education will, in the case of every child over a given age, combine productive labor with instruction and gymnastics, not only as one of the methods of adding to the efficiency of production but as the only method of producing fully developed human beings. End quote. Marx, 1992a, 614. Marx furthermore adds that one should not deprive, quote, ordinary criminals, of their sole means of betterment, productive labor. End quote. Marx, 1989a, 99. The Marxian aporia around the concept of labor seems undeniable. Nevertheless, it does still remain possible to distill a coherent critique of labor from the most radical core of Marxian reflections presented in several of his writings. I would like to propose that this critical understanding of labor is that most consistent with the spirit, although not always with the letter, of Marx's critique of political economy. Marxian theory possesses a clearly delimited object of study, the capitalist mode of production. In this sense, all Its categories attain validity only in the context of capitalist society and are, furthermore, understood negatively. That is, as fetishist categories which must be practically superseded. Labor cannot be exempted from this rule and escape through some backdoor. The unbearable lightness of concrete labor. Let us try then to systematize the Marxian critique of labor. In The German Ideology, Marx warns about the harms of a transhistorical notion of labor. Quote, labor is constructed from the mere abstract idea of man and nature. It is thereby defined in a way which is equally appropriate and inappropriate to all stages. End quote. Of socio-historical development. Marx and Engels, 1975, 481. Marx argues in the same vein in Volume 3 of Capital, critiquing the notion of the quote, the productive activity of human beings in general, divested of every social form and well-defined character. End quote. And as such, quote, independent of society, removed from all societies. End quote. Marx, 1998, 802. Marx calls this, quote, a mere ghost, the labor, which is no more than an abstraction and taken by itself does not exist at all, ibid. End quote. In these passages, labor, understood as transhistorical, material production in general, is presented by Marx as a perfect absurdity as the differentiating features of the various types of social and technical organization of the material reproduction of mankind throughout history are erased in the homogenizing concept of labor. Most importantly, the absolute historical exceptionality of capitalist productive activity, when compared with pre-capitalist societies, is irremediably lost. Thus, no matter how different the social mediations of its metabolism with nature are, the transhistorical notion of labor allows one to reach the ridiculous conclusion that both the Trobriand islander and the stock market broker work. However, we have also shown that, in his later, mature works, Marx introduces the twofold concept of labor, concrete labor and abstract labor. Now, it should be emphasized that, quote, abstract labor is not a strange element to concrete labor, which seizes it from the outside, but they both form antagonistic poles of one and the same contradictory logic. 2010 and 50. Concrete labor and abstract labor are the two inseparable poles of labor, that modern form of activity. It is therefore not possible to speak of concrete labor in the absence of abstract labor and vice versa. One should thus be able to avoid the error of, quote, Mr. Proudhon, end quote, for whom, quote, every economic category has two sides, one good, the other bad, end quote. Marx, 1976b, 167. And whose aim is, quote, to keep the good side, while eliminating the bad, ibid. End quote. As also seen here, this stance is upheld by Marx himself on several occasions when analyzing the labor category and replicated in the meantime by numerous Marxists, with abstract labor perceived as the bad side of labor, the specifically capitalist form of labor, while concrete labor is understood as its good side, as the ahistorical material substratum requiring freeing from the external yoke of abstract labor. In this sense, a radical critique of labor, in order to be coherent, must acknowledge the equally modern character of concrete labor. Bruno Lamache writes as follows in this respect. Quote, if pre-modern societies are carefully observed, although the production of goods for consumption is to be found naturally in all of them, it is not exactly right to say that these societies possessed labor, just as it is not possible to say that they had free time. This is a specifically modern distinction. To subsume under the category labor a myriad of concrete activities such as fishing, sowing, harvesting, etc., is something simply unthinkable in many pre-modern societies. Even more important is the fact that these societies did not conceive the set of productive activities as a sphere separated from the remaining moments of reproduction of social life. In this sense, The very concrete activities were not always rigidly demarcated from other human activities such as play, rituals, child rearing, social conviviality, etc. End quote. Note: Claudio Duarte writes similarly that, in pre-capitalist societies, the modern separation of spheres, labor, free time, art, religion, etc., is not really or totally posited. Production is significantly enmeshed in all the group's moments and activities and not in an autonomous sphere. Quote. End quote. Duarte Deutsch Mili Norve, Quartetta e Deutsch. One can speak, in these societies, of a quote, primacy of reproduction, end quote, i.e., quote, those formations are less modes of production than modes of social reproduction of individuals, or organic members of the community. End quote. Duarte 2009, 44, emphasis in original social formations. Quote. Do not ascribe to production a central role in human life as a social mediation. End quote. Duarte, 2009, 48, emphasis in original. Endnote. Marx's concept of concrete labor implies, therefore, an abstraction from all social context of human relations, and that is already a specifically capitalist abstraction which makes sense only in the historical framework of separated spheres. Thus, quote, even though the concept of concrete labor aims only to separate analytically the necessarily material side of labor, it already presupposes a real social separation of human practices which is historically determined. End quote. Lamash 2007, 35. Therefore, concrete labor paradoxically embodies an abstraction. The material reproduction of mankind is really an autonomous sphere under the form of an economy. Labor may be defined as the economic activity, abstracted, disconnected and clearly demarcated from the remaining domains of life, religion, culture, art, etc. in temporal and spatial terms as well as regarding its cultural and symbolic meaning. Kale Polanyi speaks wisely of an economy disembedded from society. C.F. Machado, 2011. Botelho also suggests that the notion of material production in general, of concrete labor is itself a historical outcome of the capitalist mode of production. Quote, the idea of production in general is no mere logical result, rather also being a historical outcome in that only a specific social circumstance could provide the method suited to isolating its categorical determinations from the totality to which they belong. Only in a society where the meaning, functioning and purpose of production are able to detach themselves from any concrete specific features does it become possible to formulate this generic idea of production. Only with the emergence of labor could an abstract idea of production and, thus, an abstract understanding of the relation between man and nature that does away with any historical specificities, make sense. End quote. Botelho 2009, 54. These remarks are extremely important. It is only the historical advent of labor, in its double nature as abstract concrete labor, that makes it possible to depict material production in general, detached from any social or historical conditions, and to speak of an ontological concrete labor equated to the human metabolism with nature as such. The indifference of capitalist productive activity in relation to all sensuous content is projected retrospectively onto pre-capitalist societies as production in general, i.e., as concrete labor. Note: C.F. Bischoff, 1995, and Orms, 2012, for a detailed critique of the materialistic, ontological concept of labor. The crux of the matter thus stems from, to once again repeat, how the disembeddedness of material production, under the form of an economy, from all the other social, cultural, symbolic, etc. contexts, is a phenomenon exclusive to capitalist modernity. Economy, from all the other social, cultural, symbolic, etc. contexts, is a phenomenon exclusive to capitalist modernity. Concrete labor and real subsumption. The real inversion between concrete/abstract and subject/object is one of the dimensions underlying the Marxian concept of fetishism. Note: besides the dimension mentioned, fetishism in Marx also encompasses I. The attribution of real powers to inanimate objects, 2. The reification of human relations under the money form, 3. A negative social totality characterized by the impersonal domination of real abstractions. Endnote. In this sense, concrete labor is a mere form of appearance of abstract labor, that is, quote, concrete labor appears as a sensible expressive moment of the generality of productive processes, as an empirical manifestation of abstract labor. End quote. Botelho 2009, 61. Concrete labor thus constitutes the form of realization of abstract labor in sensuous reality. Therefore, the capitalist mode of production must create a material process of production, the concrete labor process, adequate to the pursuit of the endless valorisation of value. Marx deploys the real subsumption of labor under capital concept to describe this specifically capitalist material reproduction of society. Real subsumption consists of a quote, material transformation of the process of production. End quote. Botelho 2009, 70. It implies profound technological changes, in particular the dissemination of machinery and of applied sciences. Marx, 1994, 106. In short, quote, end quote. Botelho, 2009, 70. While in pre-capitalist societies technical progress was very slow, or even stationary, the capitalist mode of production relies on continuous innovation. This difference, in turn, stems from how only in capitalism does the systemic compulsion of an objective standard of material productivity emerge, socially necessary labor time, disseminated by competition among the many capitals. The technical configuration of labor mirrors the compulsion of, quote, producing an object, end quote, employing, quote, only the labor time necessary under the general social conditions of production. End quote. Marx, 1988, 197, emphasis in original. While in pre-capitalist societies the time required for producing a good was not taken into account, in capitalist society, in contrast, the intensity and the rhythm of the various productive activities attain extremely high levels. Ibid. Uninterrupted labor precisely proves a peculiar aspect of capitalism. Marx, 1988, 259. The length of time of the productive process converts itself into, quote, the only criterion for evaluating and comparing the different activities. End quote. Jacques 2006, 48. As what is at stake is, first and foremost, the creation of value. Marx writes the following in The Poverty of Philosophy. Quote, if the mere quantity of labor functions as a measure of value regardless of quality, it presupposes that men are effaced by their labor, that the pendulum of the clock has become as accurate a measure of the relative activity of two workers as it is of the speed of two locomotives. Therefore, we should not say that one man's hour is worth another man's hour, but rather that one man during an hour is worth just as much as another man during an hour. Time is everything, man is nothing, he is, at the most, time's carcass. Quality no longer matters. Quantity alone decides everything, hour for hour, day for day. End quote. Marx, 1976b, 127. Time becomes the major oppressor of human beings. Socially necessary labor time turns out to be the most powerful of overseers, coercing individuals into performing their daily, concrete activities as fast as possible. Indeed, this also helps drive the recurring transformation of the technical, technological and organizational modalities of the various concrete labors. In this respect, it becomes helpful to consider examples of activities inherently harmful to human beings, such as night work, which disturbs the circadian cycle, and working on an assembly line, which atrophies the human body because of the repeated performance of a small set of predetermined movements, or, still furthermore, those activities harmful to the natural environment, such as the extractive industries that bring about massive deforestation and soil desertification, in addition to extremely polluting and/or greenhouse gas-emitting manufacturing industries. In capitalism, all these activities are concrete labors performed solely as modes of realizing abstract labor, i.e. of producing economic value. These concrete labors are mere phenomenal forms or forms of appearance of abstract labor. However, as may be easily understood, these concrete labors, night work, work on an assembly line, polluting labor processes, etc., are not positive, innocuous, transhistorical categories that only need extirpating from their negative pole, that is, which need only to shed their character as abstract labor. Real subsumption means that the very concrete process of material production is revolutionized in taking on a specifically capitalist form and, thus, correspondingly unprecedented in human history. The apparently harmless concrete labor was entirely shaped to meet the dictates of valorisation and the criteria of profitability. Therefore, it becomes completely impossible to speak of supposedly suprahistorical concrete labor, materially identical. We're allowed to infer that the concrete side of labor does not remain unscathed by the quote, the presupposed form of socialization. End quote. Trenkler 2014, 9. Quote, concrete labor only represents the paradox of the concrete aspect of an abstraction, namely of the form abstraction labor, ibid. End quote. Thereby, it is concrete. Quote, in the very narrow and restricted sense that the different commodities require materially different production processes, ibid. End quote. But whose behavior, however, quote, is in no way indifferent, technically or organizationally, to the presupposed goal of valorization, ibid. End quote. Capitalist production is organized according to the following principle. Quote, producing the greatest possible number of products in the shortest possible time. This is then called the economic efficiency of a business. The concrete, material side of labor is thus nothing other than the tangible form in which abstract labor's diktat of time confronts the workers and forces them under its rhythm. End quote. Trenkler 2014, 10. Accordingly, the technological, technical and scientific modes of organization of capitalist material production do not reflect some neutral category susceptible to appropriation without any major problems within a communist society, which does not of course mean that the technologies developed under capitalism should be rejected altogether, i.e., that some of them are susceptible to utilization in different ways in other modes of production. Note: one can speak of a partial non-identity, Adorno, 2004, of technology, i.e., modern technology does not coincide entirely with its capitalist form. Endnote. In conclusion, the challenge that mankind faces is not that of freeing an ontological material substratum, concrete labor, from a supposedly external domination imposed upon it by abstract labor, but that of superseding the binomial abstract concrete labor as such. Should abstract labor be a historically specific category, then concrete labor, the material support of that abstraction, is a time-bound category as well. Consequently, it is not only abstract labor that requires abolition but also concrete labor. This entails a set of drastic transformations, especially of industrial technology, of the relationship between science and production, of the relationship between material production and nature, and of the relationship between human beings and their productive activities. The critique of use value, some brief remarks. With concrete labor thus becoming a specifically capitalist category, then its result, use value, must also represent a bourgeois feature. Use value and value are the two inseparable poles of the commodity form, the basic form of capitalist wealth. There is correspondingly no sense in speaking of an allegedly non-capitalist use value, i.e., outside the context of commodity, just as the concrete side of labor is, quote, determined by the historical dynamic, end quote. of capitalist society. Vela 2011, 61. First of all, it should be emphasized that the sensuous/material aspect of the commodity, its use value, does not reflect the purpose of capitalist production. It is merely an quote, inevitable side effect. End quote. As quote, value cannot go without a material bearer. End quote. Trenkler 2014, 9. Thus, quote, use value is not simply a material substratum with given and constant proprieties. End quote. But the quote, transformation of things with the purpose of creating value. End quote. Vela 2011, 59. Secondly, it should also be noted that use value conveys an abstract utility and not the conscious production of certain goods in order to satisfy specific needs. The content of use value is purely incidental. Quote, for capital, what is produced makes no difference: aspirin or ecstasy, spring chickens or mad cows, copies of Anna Karenina or biographies of Sarah Ferguson, delicious marmalades or napalm bombs. All product commodities are equivalent. What counts is that they be usefully sellable, and that the sales make profits for the capital that produced them. End quote. Basso 2003, 197, emphasis in original. This notion of a generic, useful thing is simply absent in pre-capitalist societies. Botelho warns about the quote, formal difference of the relationship with matter that all non-capitalist societies possessed. For the medieval peasant, the ancient citizen or the Native American, a certain object is never regarded as a utility in general, but as an axe, a basket, wheat, potatoes, etc. The idea of use value as such, of a generic use value, is essentially connected to an abstract productive relationship. End quote. Botelho 2009, 60. In pre-capitalist societies, objects were produced for domestic consumption, or in order to be directly appropriated by the dominant class. The category of utility in general, of use value, remained entirely unknown, as this constitutes a peculiarity of goods produced under the form of commodities. In capitalism, commodities are use values, indirectly social, useful things, that is, objects produced with the sole purpose of being exchanged and afterwards consumed by somebody else. It is important to recall that its status as a value proves the true essence of the commodity, its use value only endowing its phenomenal form. Thus, use value, in its abstraction, refers merely to the fact that a given good any good form of value must then realize itself in sensuous reality, that is, in need of some kind of material support. Since use value results from a specifically capitalist process of material production, it constitutes the incarnation, the embodiment of the irrationalities of that mode of production. Marx's reasoning about use value is also aporetical. On the one hand, Marx grants use value with the status of a transhistorical category, arguing that use value is a neutral result of the concrete labor process. Marx, 1988, 59. The content of wealth in all human societies. Marx, 1988, 40. On the other hand, in his notes on Wagner, Marx writes that, quote, in order to produce a commodity, end quote, one, quote, must not only produce use value, but use value for others, social use value. So use value itself, as the use value of the commodity, possesses an historically specific character. End quote. Marx, 2002, 242, emphasis in original. Therefore, Marx reaches the conclusion that social use value, i.e. the use value of the commodity, is a historically specific category. He was not able, however, to take the next logical step. In this case, why should the same ahistorical concept of use value continue being used to designate the goods produced in pre-capitalist societies? In much the same way as the concept of concrete labor, The supposedly ontological category of use value contradicts the ethos of the Marxian critique of political economy, which postulates the historicity of all its categories. In the capitalist mode of production, all goods are produced as commodities, wherefore possessing a deeply contradictory nature. The indifference of form, value, regarding content, use value, means that content itself very often takes on a destructive and irrational character. It suffices to consider the example of planned obsolescence. In capitalism, many commodities are produced beforehand with certain inferior physical, bodily features that ensure their rapid wear and tear and the recurring need for their replacement with new commodities. Furthermore, a vast array of the products supplied is inherently harmful to human beings, whether military equipment, food containing cancerous substances or the individual automobile running on fossil fuels. The automobile provides one of the most extreme examples of a harmful use value. Such vehicles are highly polluting and a greenhouse gas emitting technology. Its historical rise as the main means of transportation entailed an unprecedented destruction of natural landscapes, the construction of millions of miles of paved roads, and urban landscapes. Streets became the natural habitat of the automobile, while human beings became unwanted intruders. Furthermore, the automobile also ultimately fails to fulfill its primordial task, allowing individuals to move quickly. Since its proliferation is counterproductive, the greater the number of automobiles, the greater the traffic jams and the lower the average speed of circulation in major contemporary cities, which, in some cases, is now equivalent to the average speed of animal-powered transportation. Endnote. In this sense, we may indeed conclude that use value is not a neutral category that lends itself to being simply extirpated from the value form or appropriated in any straightforward manner. Note. However, it is possible to discern also a partial non-identity regarding use value, that is, use value does not coincide totally with the destructive logic of the commodity. There are, for sure, a vast array of goods and services, produced nowadays as commodities, which would be considered beneficial to human beings and would continue being produced in a non-capitalist form in a hypothetical future communist society. For instance, bread, as a basic foodstuff in the diet of almost every human culture, would certainly still be produced in a post-capitalist society, although its production process, both technically and materially, would no longer represent a labor process. Endnote. Conclusion. From labor time to free time. This article has demonstrated that the young Marx rules out any notion of labor as the quote, essence of man. End quote. Marx and Engels, 1975, 482. Furthermore, traces of this stance linger on right through to the Grundrisse, in which Marx claims, for example, that quote, the positing of the individual as a worker in this nakedness is itself a product of history. End quote. Marx, 1993, 472, emphasis in original. Moreover, in Marx's view, as a specifically capitalist form of activity, labor should be abolished without further ado, cf. Section 2. However, from a contribution to the critique of political economy onwards, Marx completely abandons the idea of abolishing labor. Zilberschied 2004, 135. We would note, however, that Marx nevertheless continues to conceive of non-labor time as the greatest expression of the freedom of human beings. Time is the room of human development. A man who has no free time to dispose of, whose whole lifetime, apart from the mere physical interruptions by sleep, meals, and so forth, is absorbed by his labor, is less than a beast of burden. He is a mere machine for producing foreign wealth, broken in body and brutalized in mind. End quote. Marx, 1985, 142. Nevertheless, Marx no longer seems to believe that the material reproduction of society can be organized in a non-instrumental way. Zilberschied 2004, 138. Thus, in Volume 3 of Capital, Marx revives the idea, introduced in the Grundrisse, cf. 3.2, of building the realm of freedom over and above the realm of necessity. with the latter understood as the locus of labor. Marx states that the purpose of the higher form of society should be the greatest possible limitation of the quote, time devoted to material labor. End quote. Marx, 1998, 806. 4. Quote, the realm of freedom actually begins only where labor which is determined by necessity and mundane considerations ceases, thus in the very nature of things it lies beyond the sphere of actual material production. End quote. Marx, 1998, 807. Social development brings with it an expansion to individual wants and needs. Quote, but, at the same time, the forces of production which satisfy these wants also increase. Freedom in this field can only consist in socialized man, the associated producers, rationally regulating their interchange with nature, bringing it under their common control, instead of being ruled by it as by the blind forces of nature, and achieving this with the least expenditure of energy and under conditions most favorable to, and worthy of, their human nature. But it nonetheless still remains a realm of necessity. Beyond it begins that development of human energy which is an end in itself, the true realm of freedom, which, however, can blossom forth only with this realm of necessity as its basis. The shortening of the working day as its basic prerequisite, ibid. End quote. Despite this apparent theoretical regression, I believe there is scope for harmonizing this stance with the radical idea of abolishing labor present in his early works. Whenever concrete labor gets understood as a historically specific category, inseparable from abstract labor, then the abolition of the latter, unquestionable in the mature Marx, implies the abolition of the former. In other words, mankind's process of material reproduction in a post-capitalist society, i.e. the activities in the realm of necessity of Volume 3 of Capital, cannot under any circumstances be called labor. Furthermore, what is at stake here is clearly not mere pedantry around the nomenclature of productive activities, but rather the practical transformation of human metabolism with nature, which will then lose all the social and material characteristics abolishes not only the valorisation process, but also the labor process. In the absence of capital, there will obviously be no real subsumption of material production, which will then take on a post-capitalist form otherwise unprecedented throughout human history. Claudio Duarte argues convincingly that, quote, production may not only cease to be a labor process, a place of coercion and necessity. End quote. Contrary to what the late Marx suggests, quote, but also cease to be the central moment in life. End quote. Duarte 2009, 59, emphasis added. In this sense, quote, production becomes a mere material presupposition, end quote, losing its preponderance within the, quote, new ordering of social space and time, end quote. Duarte 2009, 61, emphasis in original.